Hi, good afternoon. Welcome. This is many things. This is formally a course, Graduate Seminar in Injury Research and Policy for the first term. If you're a new student or you're not aware, the same course is available. Each of our first through the fourth term. It focuses on different topics relevant to injury and violence. The first term seminars will all be focused on interpersonal violence. In addition to this being a course, it's an open seminar not only to our university and school, but we invite individuals from beyond. So through the term. We may have individuals from the police department, from the mayor's office, health department, community-based organizations that are working on issues relevant to violence prevention, and that's quite intentional. And I think that's one way that this seminar is special, and I think that students will really benefit not simply from hearing about the research, but also hearing from individuals about sort of what that research means to them as they go about their work to try to reduce violence. The other thing is that to the degree possible, I'm also going to be trying to relate things to Baltimore. I'm sure maybe many of you actually signed up for this course, at least in part because you live in Baltimore, you care about Baltimore and the rate of violence that we're experiencing right now. There is a list of seminars, pardon me, that Shawnee, who's a teaching assistant, Shawnee Buggs, will be teaching assistant for the seminar course. Again, if you're a student, you'll have access to all that information. But if you're just someone who's interested here and want to know about the seminars, well, there's a sheet with each of the seminars listed and their dates and the speakers that are coming. Really excited about the seminar series, bringing in a lot of really great researchers, and again, I think it'll be a useful seminar. The bookend, so to speak, of the seminar series are each going to focus on gun carrying. This topic today, we're going to talk about legal gun carrying. And in our last seminar of the term, we're going to talk about illegal gun carrying. They're, of course, related, but different policy tools and strategies to address both of these issues. I'm going to share this seminar with my PhD advisee, Alex McCord, who is not only an expert on gun policy and gun law, he's also studying some of these very specific laws that we'll be talking about for his dissertation, and particularly the unexplored area of how policies that encourage gun carrying may affect suicide rates. Because more commonly we think about gun carrying in the context of interpersonal violence. Let's see if, I guess that's not working. So to many people, when they think about guns and gun carrying, they think about it in fairly simple terms that would be summarized by Wayne LaPierre, Executive Vice President of the National Rifle Association. He uttered this very famous line that gets repeated over and over by him, but by others as well, following the tragedy at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown. And really kind of sums up a philosophy. The only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. And that's, of course, underlies the whole policy movement towards deregulating gun carrying in public places. I'd like this simple graphic that sort of summarizes, again, the general mindset or frame of mind about gun carrying, legal gun carrying. And so the first panel is the bad guys with guns with unhappy faces when they're facing good guys that are armed. But the bad guys become happy because they can shoot the good guys if they don't have guns. So that's basically the philosophy put forward, in that if we don't allow citizens to be armed in almost all contexts, it just makes them sort of sitting ducks for the bad guys with guns. Of course, the relationship between, in epidemiologic terms, we think of it as exposure. If you're carrying a gun, we can think of that as exposure, just as we think of a variety of risk factors in public health. The truth of the matter, when a lot of this gets boiled down to the basic relationships between gun availability and outcomes like homicides or suicides and violent crime, we often talk about in our public health context in relative risk terms. Okay, I'll summarize some of the data as we know on relative risk. But absolute risk, of course, is very relevant to this discussion as well. And I think when it comes both to gun ownership as well as carrying guns and legal carrying of guns in public places, we have a situation of low absolute risk, okay? There are a lot of people who are legally carrying guns throughout our country who have not harmed anyone and probably won't harm anyone, okay? But in relative risk terms, there's reason to be concerned that they are increasing risk. Which will, of course, have impacts on population rates of violence. So we know that states that have higher rates of gun ownership, after you control for the many ways that states differ from one another with respect to demographics and risk factors for things like homicides, that the more guns, basically, the higher the homicide rate and suicide rate as well, and even higher rates of police officers being shot in the line of duty. What's a little bit difficult to disentangle, however, is the direction of the causal arrow, meaning that it may be that citizens are arming themselves because other factors in their environment make them feel at greater risk, and it is those other factors that actually are associated with the elevated risks. So there's a little bit of debate and a fair amount of complexity to try to disentangle those causal arrows. When we think about guns in home, there's been a variety of case control studies that are frankly the best we can do to understand this relationship, but far from ideal. And the elevated risk from keeping a gun in your home ranges in these studies from anywhere from an increased homicide risk of about 40% to almost a threefold increase in homicide rates. Well, what's very important to understand, of course, these are average risk, and there's good reason to believe that there's a great deal of variability across households and individuals based upon their background risk factors. If you look at, there's very little research on permit holders themselves. This is in part intentional, frankly, because states are guarding those data. But in the state of Texas, there's been some research published in American Journal of Public Health that shows that their rate of offending, when you compare them to people without concealed carry permits, is actually quite low, as little as a tenth as high as individuals that don't hold permits. Of course, that's not the only way that these individuals differ, whether they have a permit or not. Generally speaking, permit holders are a demographic, frankly, like myself, suburban white male, married kind of demographic that has the highest rates of concealed carry permits. So it's a generally low offending group. But what they found in this study in Texas permit holders is that when they did offend, the type of offenses that they were connected to were likely to be far more deadly or potentially deadly. And this will be reflected in this graphic right here, which basically shows the percent of all crimes that are connected to the specific crimes on the x-axis for permit holders versus non-permit holders. And what you see is, as you get to intentional killings, weapons offenses, and deadly kinds of things that may be anywhere from a murder to manslaughter, you have a 2 to 4-fold higher ratio for permit holders versus non-permit holders. So it may well be that all things being equal, what's going on with the permit holders is while their absolute risk of offending is low, really considerably low, that offending may be more on the deadly end of the spectrum for understandable reasons because they're more likely to be armed. What are the key questions to try to sort out what we should expect with the kind of policies that actually I'm starting to talk about right to carry policies, and I realize I'm not describing those policies. That's what Alex is going to do in just a moment here. I'm sort of setting the stage. But here are some of the key questions that I'll kind of hit one by one. First is, how well do our current standards for legal gun possession identify individuals at risk? So the general, in Wayne LaPierre's terms, the good guys, okay? In basically what that means is, can you legally possess a gun? But it sort of suggests that we have some perfect system to identify those with violent tendencies who are otherwise reckless or potentially dangerous. And what I want to convey to you is that there's a great deal of variability across our states, but most have fairly low standards for legal gun ownership. So you can have a history of crime and violence and still legally possess guns in most of our states, and also carry those guns concealed and loaded, as well as open carry. Open carry is a question we're going to just talk about at the end. I know open carry is like really hot right now. We're going to be talking principally about concealed carry because that's sort of where the data are. We'll open that up. But what I want to convey is that for the states we found, in the states with the most lax standards for legal gun ownership, about 60% of those who are incarcerated for committing violent crimes with guns were legal. They were Wayne LaPierre's good guys for guns before they were bad guys with guns, if that makes sense. And it's quite distinct from the states with the higher standards. About a third are legal to possess guns in these other states. So there's a big difference. How common are circumstances when civilians can actually effectively and safely use their guns in self-defense? And then a separate, even more fundamental but difficult to answer question is, just because they occur, are they necessary? So someone can say, I felt threatened, I pulled out my gun, and they ran away, okay? And that could be seen from one vantage point as, wow, that was effective use of a gun, but the separate question is, did they need to use a gun in that situation? Our data to really understand defensive gun use is, in a word, crappy. Yes, there are some records from police investigations, but I don't think anyone believes that that's a good way to capture such incidents, because many times civilians will not report such incidents to the police. So by and large, we've relied upon self-report. And there's a national criminal victimization survey that has measured this. And what those data indicate is that a little less than 1% of victimizations, violent crime victimizations, someone reports that they used or attempted to use a gun in self-defense. About 2/3 of those self-defensive gun uses were outside the home, which is the context we're talking about today. There's a very good reason to believe, however, that this is a very upward biased estimate because it's based upon self-report. And there is a lot of gray area and mushiness about when it is an incident defensive versus hostile or aggressive. And in some instances where you've got to say someone attempting a robbery, it's a very clear-cut kind of case. But the far and away the most common form of violent crime is an assault. And an assault often is some sort of conflict situation between individuals where the aggressor versus victim is often difficult to ascertain. David Hemingway and his colleagues did a survey to, in addition to gathering information on self-reported defensive gun uses, also self-reported hostile or aggressive ways that they've used their guns, and actually found that even through self-report, gun owners report far more commonly the hostile versus defensive uses of guns. If you break down the incidents in which individuals are using guns in the National Crime Victimization Survey, 19% said the offender had a gun. And there you could sort of understand a justification for why someone might want to use a gun. However, a similar percentage involved crimes in which someone was being verbally threatened. So like, I'm going to get you or I'm going to beat you up, and then you pull your gun out kind of scenario. When Hemingway and his colleagues looked at these crime incidents and when victims attempted or used their gun when a crime was occurring, basically when you control for other factors, it did not tip the scales in the favor of the victim in either direction. There was no significant relationship with the presence of a gun. Of course, a critical question is how commonly does having a gun turn anger into death or other kind of serious outcomes? In recent years, we're seeing a notable increase in road rage with guns being documented by the Gun Violence Archive. And in this particular instance, you had literally a shootout from 2 different cars with people with concealed carry permits in the Milwaukee area. How do persons consider violent attacks respond to expectations that someone might be, a potential victim might be armed? So if you're passing a right to carry law, you're sort of announcing to the world, including those who might be prone to commit crimes, that their victims might be more likely to be armed. An old study by criminologists Jim Wright and Peter Rossi found when they talked to criminals and asked them, the criminals did say, you know, if I'm going to commit a crime against someone, I may not if I think they're armed, which sort of is logical. On the flip side of this, Philip Cook has studied the relationship between prevalence of gun ownership and the likelihood that criminals use firearms when they do commit crimes, and does indeed see a positive correlation that criminals, perhaps again very logically, would be more likely to use firearms if they anticipate they're in areas where a lot of people are carrying guns. There's also some research that sort of suggests that there is a very understandable contagious phenomenon, that if you think a lot of people are carrying guns, you're more likely to carry guns, and that you're also more likely to be preemptive in your acts with those guns. Because again, you don't want to be the second one to reach for your gun in such instances. So Alex is now going to walk us through the various kinds of state policies as it relates to regulating concealed carry, and then I'll cover some new data coming out on it.
Okay, my name's Alex, like Daniel said. I'm just going to run quickly through kind of the policy landscape surrounding public carry with a focus on concealed carry. So in general, public carry is almost exclusively regulated at the state level. There are a few federal laws that affect public carry. Most of those have to do with where you can carry a gun, like in a national park, for example. But almost every other law governing public carry is at the state level. When we're talking about public carry, we're talking about two different types. There's open carry, which is where you can see it. You can see what somebody's carrying. The most prominent example is maybe somebody like you've seen recently in the news at maybe a protest or a rally that has a big long gun strapped across their back. Most states allow open carry, although there are a few that prohibit it. And a minority that allow it require you to have a permit to open carry. Concealed carry, which is exactly what it sounds like, carrying a firearm that's hidden somewhere on your body or in your bag, your purse, is allowed in every state. Most states require a permit, but there are some that don't. This has not yet been addressed by the Supreme Court, so you'll hear a lot of talk about the Second Amendment and individual rights here. But the Supreme Court has focused in their opinions mostly on the right to have a firearm in your home. They have not yet taken up a case that deals with public carrying of firearms. There are some lower courts that have, but there is a fairly big split among those courts as to whether they see an individual right or not. In terms of concealed carry, there are four general categories. There are no-issue states, which means that the states don't issue a permit and, in fact, ban concealed carry. Like I said before, there are no states that are in this category right now, although historically, even as recently as 2010, 2011, there were states that banned concealed carry outright. The second category is may issue, which is pretty discretionary as for the permitting process. So you apply for a permit, and if you meet these baseline criteria, the issuing body or the government, state government, is going to do a little bit more of an investigation into whether you're a good candidate to have a concealed carry permit. Then there are shall issue states. In those states, if you meet the baseline criteria, you are eligible for a permit no matter what. If you apply and you meet the criteria, they have to give you a permit. Then the last category is permitless carry. In those states, as long as you meet some fairly lax criteria like age and no criminal background, you can just carry a concealed handgun without a permit. There's no process to qualify for that. 49 states and DC issue concealed carry permits. Vermont is the only state that doesn't. Vermont is a permitless state and has, I think, always been a permitless state, and they've never issued permits. Within these categories, there are important differences. First, there are different issuing bodies. So in some states, you can get a permit from the sheriff or other law enforcement body. In other states, you're going to a state attorney general. And there are even some states where you have to petition a court to get a permit. The states vary in terms of permit length as well. So there are some states that only give 1-year permits, and there are actually some states that allow you to get lifetime permits. The most common is a 4 to 5 year cycle, that every 4 or 5 years you have to apply for a renewal of your permit. Every state has place-based restrictions for concealed carry. So those, maybe the most common one is university or college campuses, or maybe not most common, but most famous. That varies a lot from state to state, whether or not you're allowed to have a concealed weapon on campus. They also vary in terms of training requirements and what are called good cause requirements, and reciprocity provisions, which I'll explain briefly. So training varies quite a bit across states. In general, it consists of training on state and federal laws, some safe storage practices, things like that. In about half of states that issue permits, you have to do some kind of live fire training or demonstration. That might mean that the state, there are some states that say you have to go to a range and you have to fire 100 rounds and you have to hit a target a certain percentage of the time. There are other states that just say you have to spend an hour on the range and there's no more direction. And then there are some states that don't require this at all. In fact, there are a few where you can just take an online course and that's sufficient. The good cause requirements are requirements that you show that you have a good reason for carrying a concealed weapon. So, for example, in Maryland, you have to show that you have a good and substantial reason for carrying a concealed weapon to be eligible for a permit. There are also states with good character requirements, which means that you have to show that you have suitable character to qualify for a concealed permit. In Delaware and New Jersey, you have to provide references or letters from people that you know or people in the community that give you some kind of, that vouch for you as somebody that's responsible enough to do this. So, like I said, there are permitless states where there are 12 states where you can carry without a concealed carry permit. But in 11 of those states, they still issue permits. And there are at least two primary reasons, I think, for why these states issue permits. A resident of these states might want a permit because you qualify for a background check exception if you have one of these permits. So in general, if you're purchasing a firearm from a federally licensed dealer, you have to undergo a background check at some point in the purchasing process. However, if you have a concealed carry permit in that state where you're trying to purchase a firearm and it was issued within the last 5 years and that process involved a background check, you don't have to undergo a background check every single time you purchase a firearm. So that's one reason that you might want a permit in a permitless state. Another reason is reciprocity. So some states have reciprocity agreements with other states, and they honor permits that are issued by those other states. There are some states, I think like Alabama, that recognize all permits. So as long as you have a permit, you can carry in Alabama. There are also some states that limit reciprocity to other states that meet certain permitting criteria. So maybe I can carry in another state, I can visit another state and carry there as long as my state requires training as part of the process. There are a few states, including Maryland, California, New York, that don't recognize any out-of-state permits. So to carry a concealed weapon in New York, you have to have a New York permit. There's no mechanism for recognizing an out-of-state permit. Importantly, out-of-state permit holders are still subject to place-based restrictions in other state gun laws. So if I live in a state where guns are allowed on college campuses and I travel to a state where they're not, even if the state recognizes my permit, I still can't take my gun onto college campuses. I'm still subject to their state laws. There are two bills in Congress right now that will probably be getting more and more attention as the fall goes on that would establish what they're calling nationwide reciprocity. This would allow anyone with a valid permit or anyone who is entitled to carry a firearm in their state of residence to carry a concealed firearm in any other state. So the two categories there are if I had a Maryland concealed carry permit, I could carry in any other state, whether or not there was a reciprocity agreement. The other category is a little bit more striking, and that's if I live in a permitless state and I'm entitled to carry a concealed firearm without a permit, I can carry a concealed firearm without a permit in any other state. This doesn't affect place-based restrictions, so those are still in place, but there is a fair amount of concern, I think rightfully so, that this will make law enforcement jobs much more complicated. There's some debate over whether carrying a weapon is enough for a stop to investigate whether or not you have a valid permit. And if you're from a permitless state, law enforcement would then be expected to know whether the state that you're from on your ID is a permitless state. And in fact, in the bill, there is a provision that says that you may be responsible, you'll be able to receive attorney's fees from if you were arrested for illegally carrying a firearm and it turned out that you were allowed to, the state would be required to pay for your attorney. So now I'm just going to run through a few maps of how these policies have changed over the last 30, 40 years. So this is 1980. In 1980, the vast majority of the country is either no issue or may issue. So the no issue states are in red or orangish, and the may issue are in yellow. There are only 5 shall issue states, and Vermont is the only permitless state. By 1990, still the majority of the country is either no issue or may issue, but there are quite a few more shall issue states, and Vermont is still the only permitless state. By 2000, in the 90s, so in the 90s, there's a pretty big shift toward shall issue. So the majority of the country is now under a shall issue scheme. There are still, I think, 7 no issue states and a few more may issue. Vermont is still the only permitless state, but not for long. In 2010, again, even more states. I think there are 37 states in 2010 that are shall issue states. There are, I believe, 9 may issue states and just 2 no issue states. Wisconsin and Illinois both were still no issue, didn't allow concealed carry at all in 2010. Alaska became a permitless state in 2003, and actually Arizona became a permitless state about midway through 2010, but these graphs are rounded to the nearest year, so it doesn't show up quite yet. So this is today. So over the last 7 years, there have been 10 more states that have become permitless. There are now 12 total. There are 30 shall issue states and 8 may issue states, plus DC is also a may issue jurisdiction. And there are no more no issue states. So over the last 37 years, there's been a huge shift away from more regulation of concealed carry to even less. And this shift, especially toward permitless over the last 7 years, is really interesting in light of the nationwide reciprocity bill, which I described earlier as being particularly complicated when it comes to permitless states. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Daniel to talk about potential effects of these.
All right. Thank you, Alex. Yeah, quite striking how dramatically the United States has changed its policies in recent decades and years. And so what impact has that had? That's what we're going to cover in the remaining part of this discussion. Typical way that we go about estimating the effects of any policy outcome, state policy outcome, is we do some sort of comparative trend analysis. We're going to compare, in this case, trends in states that adopted. I recognize I'm using the right to carry rather than what Alex was referring to. Principally, what I'm talking about is shall issue. States that went from either a no issue or may issue into the shall issue range, where it becomes incredibly easy to get permits for the most part. So we have 50 states. A very common way that many people have studied this is just compare all those 50 states with respect to how their crime rates are changing in relationship to right to carry laws. And, use regression analysis and try to control for a variety of things that are regularly measured at the state level from year to year. Things like demographic characteristics, poverty, unemployment, those kinds of things. While these measures really do a reasonably good job of explaining cross-sectional variation, why one state has a higher rate of crime or homicide than another, generally speaking, they don't do a fantastic job of actually predicting change over time. And it's believed that that's due in part to the fact that a lot of these drivers of trends as things go up or down in particular areas are things that are not so easy to measure. Changes in drug markets, changes in social norms, things of that nature. So a lot of this comes down to these unmeasured conditions and sort of what are the best comparisons. So Alex showed you the states that have made the changes. We didn't, really dig down too much in the details, but you can see that most of these states who are going into the right to carry or shall issue or permitless carry are not your coastal, heavily metropolitan kind of states. They're more in the center and south. And when you're comparing changes over time, you have to wonder, can you control for all those unmeasured factors when you're doing these comparative right to carry versus no right to carry laws? Well, the first major study that tried to estimate the impacts of some of the early changes in right to carry laws was conducted by an economist named John Lott. His first paper was published with David Muster in 1996. But Lott subsequently used that research to come out with a book, More Guns, Less Crime. And he generated data that indicated that making it easier to get permits to carry concealed weapons had a fairly dramatic and positive effect in reducing violent crime. And this is a quote from the Lott and Mustard article: "Concealed handguns are the most cost-effective method of reducing crime thus far analyzed by economists, providing higher return than increased law enforcement or incarceration," which are things that maybe a lot of us would feel like it's a better way to reduce violent crime than through those mechanisms, or even private security or social programs like early education. Very, very controversial piece of research that has had an enormous impact on the changing map that Alex showed you. His research was very instrumental in facilitating some of those changes, and Lott indeed went on a state-to-state tour with his data to convince state lawmakers to go in this direction. There have been a number of studies that have sought to and found a variety of flaws and holes in John Lott's analysis as it relates to concealed carry. Some of this was actually prompted the formation of a National Research Council panel to evaluate research on this topic as well as other related topics of guns and violence. The National Research Council panel concluded, after reviewing the data, Lott's data, that basically there were too many flaws to hold up Lott's claims. Subsequent researchers who got their hands on the data and started to dig into this more in-depthly found a number of errors just in the basic laws, how laws were coded, as well as in some of the crime data. Those are fairly straightforward things to correct. More complicated, of course, is how you do the statistical modeling, and I'm not going to dig too much in the details of there, but Lott basically threw a variety of very, very, very long list of variables into his regression analyses, and basically with the idea more is better. But more thoughtful researchers identified a number of problems with that approach that led to endogeneity and significant biases that produces. While a lot went into those models, there are important things that did not go into the model, principally as it relates to changing levels of policing and incarceration, which were changing fairly dramatic over the same time that right to carry laws were going into effect. The other factor that came out very clearly from their reanalysis of this data is just how different the pre-existing underlying trends were in the states adopting these laws, particularly the early adopters of the laws versus the states that weren't adopting right to carry. So I'm going to share with you now what I consider to be the best available research that just recently came out a few months ago, led by John Donahue, an economist at Stanford University's Law School and Economics program. He and his colleagues analyzed data from 1977 through 2014. While he did do some regression analysis that I'll summarize, their principle, what they determined was the most valid way to estimate these laws' effects is using a method that's becoming a little more common now that we've used in some of our research studying gun policy, something called a synthetic control approach that I'll try to describe succinctly here. What this method does is try to identify the subset of states, of a general pool of states that might be controlled, states that weren't adopting right to carry, and identify which of those states in combination best enable you to forecast how crime would change in the states that are adopting the laws. So that the estimated effect or the difference in the post right to carry law period would be the difference between your synthetic control and your actually observed rate in the right to carry states. Typically, the way you determine whether any such difference between those two are meaningful or statistically significant is through a series of sort of placebo tests where you do comparison analysis, similar kind of synthetic controls, in which you, if states would have adopted that didn't, and how much their laws changed. Just to give you a little feel for what this looks like on a couple state-by-state basis. So this is Texas. Texas adopted its shall issue or right to carry law in 1996. This shows you the dark line, the violent crime rate in Texas, and in the dotted line is the synthetic control. So by and large, except for one peak in the around 1990, pretty good job of forecasting how violent crime would change with this methodology. What you'll see here is then these two lines start to diverge one another after the shall issue or right to carry law occurs, and that difference grows over time. And I'll get back to why that might be particularly important in trying to understand the effects of these laws. Here's Arizona. Similar kind of pattern here as we saw in Texas, with the divergent, generally good prediction rate, but then diverging and those differences growing generally over time. And this sort of points out also just sort of the importance of how you can just very basic comparisons before and after these laws can be grossly misleading. So groups or individuals who basically are trying to advance these laws, which many of them went into effect in the early 1990s, we had our biggest crime drop nationally, regardless of right to carry status, during the same period that these laws were coming into effect. So yes, violent crime did go down dramatically here in Arizona as it did in Texas, but the question is, would it have gone down more rapidly had they not adopted right to carry laws? And that's sort of what the synthetic control approach tries to ascertain. Here's a little more complex situation in case of Pennsylvania, simply in part because Pennsylvania sort of did this in two pieces. In 1989, they adopted right to carry, except for the jurisdiction of Philadelphia, a very urban, obviously, jurisdiction in which legal gun carrying might pose different kind of risk and benefits as opposed to other parts of the state. And then in 1996, Philadelphia went in that direction. And there's when you start to see the divergence that you saw in those other states I was sharing with you. So Donahue and colleagues looked at these, did these for the range of states, a lot of state changes, as Alex indicated. There is a range of estimates. The median estimate was a 14% increase in violent crime across these states, or a mean of about a little over 11% increase. And this increase, I should be specific, this is at year 10, okay? So, and I'll show you how this changes over time. So what Donahue and colleagues did, I think was very helpful, is generate state year-by-year estimates, what happens right after right to carry law is adopted, and does that, if any effect, change over time. And what you see very clearly here is that the effect does grow over time, and it only becomes statistically significant in years 7, 8, 9, and 10, not in these early years. So presumably, what is going on here is that you have more and more people with permits and more gun carrying, as well as a change in social norms. More people see their friends or other people carrying guns. They say, hey, that seems like a good idea because so many other people are walking around with guns or driving around with guns. Maybe I'll have one too. The initial models looking at the category of murder and non-negligent manslaughter were not statistically significant. At year 10, it was about a 5% higher than was forecasted by the synthetic controls. But what they found is that the right to carry states were changing following adoption of those laws in important ways with respect to policing and incarceration rates. So compared to non-right to carry states. So our incarceration, for example, increasing 28% in the right to carry states versus 19% in control, and a slight difference in policing levels as well. When they re-estimate these effects to control for these important factors that are correlated, by the way, with violent crime rates at the state level, they find that by year 10, you have a 10% increase, higher rates of murder and non-negligent manslaughter in right to carry states. They do, as I indicated, a variety of regression analysis. Their preferred models that are most supported by data and statistical tests are fairly consistent with the synthetic control models. Prior studies have also found similar crime-generating effects of right to carry laws, most of them using regression techniques. And interestingly, one such study that by Kovancik and colleagues was rather interesting. Their sort of summary findings in their abstract and conclusions is that right to carry laws don't impact crime. Yet in their data, it actually shows the opposite. That the more years a right to carry law was in effect, that crime did indeed increase at a statistically significant rate. We have almost no data on this other important shift from shall issue to permitless carry. There's one study published with data in southern Arizona, looking at when Arizona changed in 2010, is that right, Alex? To permitless carry. And they looked at hospital ED data as well as crime data. They found no change in violent crime overall, but interestingly, they did see a statistically significant 27% increase in homicides with guns. So it's sort of consistent with what I think a lot of people who study this area believe, which is that generally speaking, one of the most important things that a gun does is it elevates the lethality of crime more than anything. Why might some of one thing that I didn't mention when I was sort of laying out these questions or how more people carrying guns could affect crime in either direction, I didn't point out an important point that's being observed now. In large number of cities throughout the country, particularly in states with the most lax laws for concealed carry, we're seeing a very substantial increase in thefts of guns from motor vehicles. And a study published recently by David Hemingway and colleagues found that in a survey, national survey of gun owners, after you control for other factors, having a permit to carry a concealed weapon was associated with a threefold increase in likelihood of reporting having a firearm stolen. So this could be one really important mechanism by which a lot of people carrying guns around with them may affect crime rates. It's not only the crimes that those permit holders have, but it's also generally getting more guns in the environment and into the hands of criminals. What conditions might affect? As you saw, there was a range of estimates across states based upon Donahue's models of what these laws impact of crime. And he has not formally sort of done effect modification test. He did demonstrate that there was a somewhat of an association with higher harmful effects the higher the prevalence of gun ownership was, which sort of makes sense. If you have a very low prevalence of gun ownership and then you say, okay, now people can get permits, fewer people will probably do that and get permits as opposed to places where it's more the norm that you have guns, and then you would then start to carry those guns outside the home in more common ways. But what hasn't been examined that we want to examine more is how these effects differ with respect to the legal standards, not just for getting a permit, but for just having a gun at all. Alex mentioned that the training requirements generally are not particularly rigorous to get these permits. But what I would suspect is that if your state allows individuals who have been convicted of perhaps numerous violent misdemeanors or numerous drunk driving offenses that are highly, highly correlated with committing violence, that those may elevate the harmful effects of these types of policies. There's been a lot of discussion on sort of place-based restrictions as now more college campuses, they're passing laws to allow guns, people with permits to bring guns onto college campuses, into schools, elementary schools, high schools, and even bars in some cases, and government buildings and so on. Sadly, we don't have much research directly on that. Last thing I'll mention is that part of the impetus for advancing laws that allow people to carry guns in public is to address the kind of events that we often see in the news that get a lot of attention, the mass shootings. So the idea is that if we all carry guns around with us, if someone walks in the door here and wants to commit a mass shooting, somebody will take that person out. When you actually look at these kinds of events, even though our country has a lot of legally armed people walking around, they almost never successfully interrupt a mass shooting. It turns out it's not a particularly easy thing to undertake in many cases. John Lott, however, has advanced this notion that the reason we have so many darn mass shootings in this country is that we have too many gun-free zones, places where guns are prohibited, and that's why the folks are literally sitting ducks. A recent book by Louis Claravis, where he analyzed the specific details of over 100 mass shootings, found that 84% were in places where guns actually were allowed for civilians, and 90% were in places where at least somebody, security or somebody, had armed or could legally have arms. And basically, there's no connection that we've been able to, anyone's been able to find between mass shootings and right to carry laws. So that's what I was going to cover today. As I mentioned before, I did not get into what we could probably have a whole separate seminar on, which is open carry questions. But I wanted to see what questions or comments people had with the material that we've covered on this part. Anything? Nothing? Oh, okay. Molly, I'm going to ask you to go to that mic there. We're actually video recording this, so not to make you nervous, Molly, but you're being videotaped.
Okay, I'll try to remember that and how I'm phrasing. So I actually had two questions. The first was related to when Alex was talking about the character references that were required for permits. I was wondering if there were limits on who you could serve as character references and if there was any liability associated with these types of laws.
I don't know if there's liability. I would suspect not. You may be just, this is totally a guess, there could be some penalty for lying, but if something, like if you legitimately believe someone was responsible and then they committed a crime, you would not be liable for that. In terms of who can do it, I think the only restriction that I can think of is that you have to be a resident of the state. So you can't get a family member from a different state or something like that. It has to be like your neighbors or your boss, something like that.
Great, thank you. And sorry, one more quick one. Is I was wondering if there was any data that looked at what is happening with, if I understood this correctly, with the 5 years between the permit and purchase of firearm, if they're finding that people are committing crimes in that, and that this is increasing.
I'll take that one. So as I indicated before, there's very little research looking at permit holders themselves, which of course would be the ideal way to do this because that data has been largely protected. I have not seen sort of a survival curve, if you will, for when those criminal offenses are occurring. I do know that the state of Kentucky sort of anticipated that kind of issue and for a number of years actually did, I forget now if it was monthly or quarterly, they would check every single permit holder to see if they became disqualified, and if so, they would make notifications. Whether they actually disarmed them or whatever, I don't know. But it's a good question. Yeah. There's a mic here if you don't mind.
Good cause? Like, what would be an example of a reason why somebody would say they need a gun?
Sure. These might be anywhere from I have an ex-boyfriend stalking me to I make deposits at the bank late at night and, need a firearm with that. So there's a variety of kind of good cause, but it all sort of, you're making a case that you're at particularly high risk because of who you are, your condition, situation, and that is what is being evaluated. And what is being challenged from a sort of legal or constitutional standpoint is that that question isn't relevant to a constitutional right, whether you're special. You have special risk. Yeah, Mitch.
I was wondering if you could speak to the effect lag that they found. Do you think that's something that has been incorporated enough in like research that's currently being conducted and on other policies as it relates to firearm prevention, something like that?
So I think that the lag issue is almost always ignored and not really thought of very carefully, sadly. And I think it certainly was not included in some of the early work that John Lott has done, as well as others. And it's easy to get, I think, wrong estimates. And I think for each policy is unique, and I think separately, if anyone's doing policy evaluation research now or in their future, you have to be very thoughtful about how you project or hypothesize what is the time relationship. Do you expect a full effect immediate, or would it grow over time for some logical reasons? I think it's very logical to think that, and we know a little bit from, actually John Lott does an amazing job of monitoring number of permits being issued. But there's enormous growth over time. It doesn't like overnight everybody gets theirs and that's it. There's clearly growth happening there. Yes?
So my question is, why are people who have these permits, why are their identities concealed if the understanding or the assumption that they're working on is that if they have these guns and people know it, they're less likely to be robbed or harmed? Wouldn't it benefit them for the public to know that they're carrying weapons?
Yeah, that's one line of logic. There's another line of logic of just, I have my own privacy rights and I don't want people to know what I'm doing. I think the other thing just is, at least one theory put forward is that if you actually didn't know who was carrying, that's actually good from a population risk. So if you announced today Maryland is going to shall issue a right to carry, criminals are sort of on notice and they don't know who's carrying, so they're just going to say, well, I'm not going to commit crime because I'm more likely to bump into somebody who has a gun. I think that's, in theory, the logic. But I think more than anything, what we found very consistently of politicians and groups that want to have the least amount of regulations on guns generally do their best to keep data hidden. Yes.
Well, I have a methodological question in the assigned reading material.
Okay.
In epidemiology, when we analyze data at population level, there is a question of ecological fallacy.
Sure. Yeah.
Are there any similar fallacies or caveats in social sciences?
Yeah. So it's a very excellent question, and so virtually all the data, save for that one slide that I had for the Texas permit holders, all of this is ecological data. So if you're seeing these correlations at a population level, it may or may not mean that the permit holders themselves have elevated their personal risk. So that is clearly an important limitation of this. I think it's important, however, to think about the potential mechanisms for which this policy might affect violent crime. And it's not exclusively by the permit holders themselves. It could be, as I mentioned before, at least two other mechanisms. One is more guns being stolen, and two, that criminals, based upon other studies anyway, appear to be more likely to use guns to commit their crimes if they anticipate the individuals that they might encounter might. So what these policies could be generating more violence not only by the permit holders themselves, but more generally in the population. You've created an environment where people are more likely to expect or anticipate that anybody you're going to get in an argument with, you might rob or whatever happened, that you're going to anticipate a gun. And so again, you don't want to be the second one to reach for your gun, you're going to be the first one.
So I understand based on the potential causal pathways just you named, it is likely that the right to carry laws is a causal risk factor for crimes. in the States.
So,
it is safe to conclude that.
well, look, this is observational research, and in policy research, we can't do randomized designs where we know with certainty and make those kind of causal inferences. So what we do is we try to use the best methodology possible to try to rule out other explanations for the associations that we're observing. So I think that it is quite plausible based upon the available data and what we know generally about firearms and how they affect behavior as well as outcomes, that it's a plausible causal link, but I think we always have to be cautious with this kind of data.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm sorry to have to move you guys around.
So I'm wondering, what are some of the policy implications of this latest research, given, I mean, in light of the clear trajectory of the country towards more shall issue? Is there any data aggregated by type of violent crime, like drug crime or domestic violence, or just sort of mass shooting or random violence? And then how can that data be harnessed for other policy interests?
So the type of violent crime that is most closely connected to right to carry is aggravated assaults, which to me makes a lot of sense. The distinction of how crime gets categorized as aggravated assault versus simple assault has to do with the severity of the injury that occurs, or if a deadly weapon is involved in that encounter. So what appears to be going on is that what might otherwise be simple assaults or people shouting at each other or whatever, you then have someone pulling out a weapon. They may or may not shoot somebody, but you're elevating what that exchange is with the firearms. There seems to be elevated risk for homicide as well, not tremendous, larger increase in the aggravated assaults. I'm less convinced of any relationship with respect to rape or robbery with these, which again to me makes sense, just what we know about the nature of those crimes. I mean, actually, if right to carry laws were sort of having this deterrent kind of effect, to me, I always felt that you would see it most clearly in the robbery data. And by and large, there's either robbery rates are positively associated or zero association, depending on the study. There's a lot of studies, so and a lot of them are frankly bad. So, but the good studies generally find either zero correlation or positive correlation with robbery. So I think, getting maybe to the underlying question of sort of, okay, what are the policy implications? I think sadly, the policies are not being implemented necessarily based on the data. It's based upon politics, identity politics, and culture, and powerful lobbying groups. The whole concealed carry movement, during the time period that Alex covered with the changing map, hunting is going down pretty steadily. So people making guns have fewer hunters to sell their guns to. What has changed dramatically is that gun owners now far more likely, the reason they are getting guns is for self-protection, and if it is for self-protection, they want to take that outside the home as well as home protection as well. So so there's industry interest here. And then I think the other thing that really, to me, kind of really, if I'm just, this is a data-driven process, right? We can show some elevated risk, But how do we counter that the vast majority of people who are legal carrying are, lower risk than average? That, I think, is the politically the challenge. And we come up, this is where public health really gets complicated, because we're considering individual issues, and considering legal issues in terms of individual rights, but we also are trying to consider population safety. So all the data to me point towards we're making our population less safe through these policies, yet the individuals who are getting the permits are generally low-risk individuals. So when they say, I have an individual right and I've never committed a crime, blah, 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 right? It's difficult politically and, perhaps legally to make those kinds of, those policies. I don't know. Any last comment or question? All right, great. I'll see you, next Monday is Labor Day. We'll see you after that.